This is Fred. And these are also Fred's. I want to give Fred a sword. No. Not all of them. I only want Fred 1 to have the sword. But how can we actually do that? Today, we're going to use an object reference to choose which Fred gets the weapon, and a class reference to choose which weapon we actually create. So what exactly is an object reference? Well, when we have some object in the level, in our case Fred 1, we can get a reference that points to him. Once we have that reference, we can do whatever we want to that particular instance of Fred. We can give him a sword, change variables like health, or just call some random function, and those actions only apply to that instance of Fred. For an object reference to point to anything useful, the object has to actually exist. For an actor, that means it was either placed in the level or spawned. For a widget, that just means it was created. We can't call an instance function on something that hasn't been created yet. Some common ways to retrieve an object reference include the return value when spawning a new actor, trace hits, overlaps, or functions like getPlayerCharacter. Now, these aren't the only ways to get object references, but you can see a pattern here. Every one of these gives us a way to retrieve a blue object reference. Spawn actor returns a new actor directly, while traces and overlaps give us a reference to the actor they hit or interacted with. With that, we can call functionality on a specific instance of an object. Now that we have an object reference for Fred 1, we can call a function to give him a sword. That's not a sword. We'll have someone clean that up. So, while an object reference points to a specific existing instance, a class reference points to the type or definition of an object. Let's try this again with a replacement Fred. This Fred already exists, so we need an object reference to choose him. But the sword doesn't exist yet. We can use a class reference to choose BP sword, spawn it, and then use the new object reference returned by the spawn actor node to give that specific sword to Fred. One really cool thing to note is that a class reference typed to a parent class can also store any of its child classes. So let's say we have this array set up to store different weapons we could give Fred. If all of our weapons share a base class like BP weapon, and we create child classes for each individual weapon, we can add any of those child classes to this array. This is commonly used for things like spawning weapons or enemies. Now that we have the correct class reference, we can spawn the sword and use the returned object to give it to Fred. So let's go back to our example with 3 Freds. Here you can see that all 3 Freds share the same class, but each Fred is a different object. An object reference allows us to point to one specific Fred. We can also move between these ideas. If we already have an object reference, and we want to know what type of object it is, we can use getClass. It takes our specific object and returns its class reference. Here are some common mistakes to avoid. When trying to spawn an actor, you must use the class reference, not an object reference. If you want to call a function or change a variable on a specific actor, you'll need an object reference to that actor, not a class reference. Remember our first Fred, the one that met an unfortunate end? What if we tried to equip a sword on him now? Unreal would give us an access to none or invalid object error. We destroyed that Fred, so the reference no longer points to a usable object. The same kind of error can also happen if a reference was never set in the first place. This is a very common error when making games, and it usually means some part of our logic isn't running the way we expected. If a reference might legitimately be empty or the object could have been destroyed, we can use the isValid node before accessing it. This checks that our reference still points to a usable object before we continue. However, it doesn't necessarily solve our problem. If the object should always exist, an invalid reference usually means something earlier in our logic needs to be fixed. So as a general rule of thumb, use an object reference when you need to communicate with a specific existing instance, and use a class reference when you need to choose what type of object to create. If that new object needs different starting values, we can mark those variables as expose on spawn and pass them in while creating it. One final thing to note, object versus class references is separate from hard versus soft references. Both object and class references can have hard and soft versions, but that deserves its own video. That's it for today's video. If you have any questions or a specific Unreal concept you'd like me to cover, leave it in the comments and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. See y'all next time.